The 16th of December, 1984, Ko Siu Tao Estate. An elevator becomes a crime scene. At the bottom, a young engineer lies dead. Above him, his best friend watches in silence, his hands trembling in prayer. What turned loyalty into this chilling betrayal? Tonight, we uncover the truth. Part 1, blood in the elevator. The elevator doors opened with the sound of metal grinding against metal. Inside, the beam of a rescue worker's flashlight cut through the darkness and revealed what would later be described in court as one of the most unsettling crime scenes in Hong Kong's history. At the bottom of the elevator shaft lay Hao Nian, a 24-year-old engineer. His body was twisted unnaturally, his face pale, and a thin plastic cord was tightly wound around his neck. Dried blood had streaked across the cold concrete floor. The sight was silent, but it spoke of violence that had been both calculated and merciless. Above him, crouched on the roof of the elevator car, was another young man. His name was Lau Man Cheung. He did not run, nor did he resist. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes, they were empty. As the officers shouted his name and demanded an explanation, he offered none. He simply stared into the darkness, his lips moving faintly, as though in prayer. Detective Chan of the Yau Tsim District Police was among the first to arrive. In his report, he later wrote that the air inside the shaft was heavy, almost suffocating, as if it still carried the echo of what had just occurred. He noted that Lau Man Cheung's calmness was far more disturbing than any sign of panic would have been. It was as though the young man was not a suspect, but a witness until the evidence began to speak for itself. When forensic investigators examined the scene, they discovered a single torn fragment of paper clutched in the victim's right hand. It was from a Bible. That single detail turned what initially appeared to be an accident into a chilling mystery. Why would a dying man hold onto a scripture page in his final moments? The elevator itself bore marks of tampering. The emergency circuit had been deliberately cut. There were no signs of forced entry from outside the building and no indication that a stranger had been involved. The implication was clear. Whoever had done this had both access and knowledge of the building's old elevator system. By 3 a.m., the scene was sealed off. Lau Man Cheung remained silent, his gaze fixed on the concrete floor. He refused to answer the officers' questions, and every minute that passed only deepened the sense of unease among the investigators. Detective Chan would later describe that moment in his case notes. Standing there, watching the suspect kneeling above the victim he once called a friend, I could not escape a single question that settled in my mind. How does a man turn from brotherhood to betrayal? And that question would soon become the heart of the investigation. How could a trusted friend become the architect of such a brutal crime? The answer would take investigators deep into a story of obsession, faith twisted into something dangerous, and a plan that had been set in motion long before the night blood was spilled in that elevator. And it all began with what seemed like the perfect friendship. Part 2, the perfect friendship. Long before the blood was found in that elevator shaft, there were 3 young lives that seemed inseparable. In the crowded housing blocks of Ko Siu Tao Estate, Lau Man Cheung, Hao Nian, and Ah Chun were known among their neighbors as the unshakable trio. They attended the same church, shared the same study sessions, and celebrated every small victory together. To those who saw them, theirs was a friendship that felt unbreakable. Lau Man Cheung stood out as the dependable one. Quiet, disciplined, and deeply devoted to his faith, he was often described as the kind of friend who would appear at your door with food when your family was struggling, or stay up late helping with exams even when he had his own. Investigators later noted that his generosity was not an act. It was a pattern that made him both trusted and respected within his community. And to Hao Nian, he was not just a friend, he was like a brother. But as detectives would later discover, even the strongest friendships can hide fractures too small for anyone to see until they break. Ah Chun was gentle and soft-spoken, a young woman whose kindness drew both Lau Man Cheung and Hao Nian closer. At first, it was harmless. They went to church together, shared meals after Sunday service, and laughed in the narrow hallways of the estate like any group of childhood companions. Yet, over time, investigators pieced together a subtle shift, a change that would never be written down but could be traced in Lau Man Cheung's private journals seized later during the investigation. In those pages, the image of friendship blurred into something darker. He wrote of signs from God, of moments he believed proved that he and Ah Chun were destined to be together. It was not open desire, it was quiet, restrained, and buried beneath layers of faith and loyalty. While Hao Nian studied late nights in the university library, Lau Man Cheung watched from the sidelines, convincing himself that patience was holy and that his love was not only real, but divinely ordained. Detective Chan described it best during an interview. He wasn't a man who snapped overnight. He was a man who convinced himself that waiting was righteousness, and that is what made him dangerous. When Hao Nian and Ah Chun eventually grew closer, it was not sudden. Their bond deepened, naturally shared conversations became longer, walks home turned into lingering moments at her doorstep, and one day they were no longer just friends. They had each other, and they did not see the shadow forming behind them. For Lau Man Cheung, that shadow was not jealousy in the ordinary sense. He did not rage, he did not lash out. Instead, he withdrew. Those who knew him recalled that his smiles grew thinner, his presence quieter, but his devotion to the pair never wavered. He continued to join them at church, to study beside them, to appear exactly as the friend he had always been. And that was what concealed the danger most of all, because no one suspected the quiet ones who prayed the hardest. Only later, as police reconstructed the timeline, did they realize this was the point where friendship turned into silent obsession. What had once been loyalty transformed into something far more insidious. Lau Man Cheung's faith, which should have grounded him, became the very tool he used to justify every thought he could not admit aloud. The detectives called it the pivot, the moment when love unreturned ceased to be sorrow and hardened into conviction. And soon, one event would strike like a spark in a sealed room. It would take that quiet conviction and turn it into a plan that would change everything and turn a friend into a predator. Part 3, first attempt, first failure. Weeks before the fatal night, there was a warning that no one recognized for what it truly was. It happened late in the evening at Ko Siu Tao Estate. Hao Nian had just walked Ah Chun home. As always, she watched him from the window to make sure he reached the ground floor safely. But that night, he never appeared. Minutes passed, and her heart began to race. Inside the elevator, Hao Nian stood trapped between two floors. At first, he thought it was just another malfunction in an old building where maintenance was always delayed. He pressed the emergency button, waiting for help. That was when the lights flickered and went out entirely. In the suffocating darkness, the sound of metal above him shifted ever so slightly. Then came the hiss. It was faint, almost unnoticeable at first, but it carried an unnatural chill. Hao Nian's vision blurred, his chest tightening as he gasped for air. Later, forensic experts would confirm that carbon dioxide had been released into the enclosed shaft. It was not enough to kill him, but enough to disorient and weaken him. Before he could react, a figure dropped down from the escape hatch above, wearing a headlamp that cut through the darkness. The man's face was hidden, but his movements were deliberate. He lunged. Hao Nian tried to fight back, but dizziness overtook him. Just as the figure raised something in his hand, the sound of footsteps in the stairwell above echoed down the shaft. The attacker froze. In a moment of hesitation that would later haunt the investigation, the man retreated, climbing back through the hatch and vanishing into the darkness. When firefighters eventually forced open the elevator doors, they found Hao Nian shaken but alive. He reported what had happened to the police, but without surveillance cameras or a clear description of his attacker, the case stalled. Detectives initially treated it as either a failed robbery or an elaborate prank. No one imagined that the man responsible was someone Hao Nian had trusted for years. But in the aftermath, small details began to surface. Investigators noted that the elevator's power circuit had been deliberately cut. There was no sign of random vandalism. Whoever had done this understood the machinery well enough to manipulate it. And one name quietly surfaced among the residents: Lau Man Cheung, a student in electromechanical engineering who had grown up in the same building as the victim. Detective Chan later admitted in his notes that this was the first moment Lau's name entered the investigation. "We didn't have evidence," he wrote, "but something about his proximity, his skills, and his silence placed him in the back of our minds." For Lau Man Cheung, however, this failed attempt was not the end. According to testimony later presented in court, he spent the days following the attack in a state of quiet calculation. Friends saw him at church as usual. He smiled, prayed, and offered his help to anyone who needed it. Yet, privately, he was adjusting his plan. The hesitation that had stopped him the first time hardened into resolve. Experts in forensic psychology would later describe this phase as the reinforcement stage. Failure did not discourage Lau. It deepened his conviction. He convinced himself that the interruption had been a test from God, and that next time, there would be no chance for mercy. Hao Nian, unaware of the storm gathering around him, returned to his daily routine. He laughed with Ah Chun, walked her home, and never once looked over his shoulder. He had survived the first attempt, but the man who was once his friend was already preparing for another. And the next time, Lau Man Cheung would not stop. He would come back. And this time, he would make sure no one walked out of that elevator alive. Part 4, the night of the murder. On the night of the 16th of December, 1984, Ko Siu Tao Estate was quiet, its concrete walls holding the sound of televisions and late-night conversations. For most residents, it was an ordinary Sunday. For Lau Man Cheung, it was the night he had been preparing for. He had spent weeks assembling everything he needed: a coil of plastic cord, a small CO2 canister, a roll of tape, a knife sharpened to precision, even a Bible tucked into his bag as though it would sanctify what he was about to do. He believed this was not murder but judgment, a test from God that only he could complete. At 10:45 p.m., Hao Nian left Ah Chun's apartment after dinner with her family. As always, she stood by the window, watching him take the elevator down. Lau was already in position. He had been there for nearly an hour, waiting in the shadows above the elevator car. He had disabled one of the building's lifts earlier in the evening to ensure that Hao Nian would take the one he had prepared. When the doors closed, Lau cut the power. The hum of the elevator stopped, and silence filled the shaft. From above, he unscrewed the emergency hatch and released the CO2. Investigators later reconstructed how the gas would have settled quickly, robbing the victim of strength without leaving immediate marks. As Hao Nian staggered, Lau descended through the hatch with mechanical precision. To him, this was not rage, it was ritual. His breathing was steady, his movements rehearsed. He struck Hao Nian with brutal efficiency, knocking him down. Then, as if fulfilling a commandment no one else could hear, he wrapped the plastic cord around his friend's neck and pulled until there was no resistance left. Forensic psychologist Dr. Leung would later explain this transformation. He did not see himself as killing a man. He saw himself as removing an obstacle to what he believed was divine order. That's why he was calm. That's why he didn't stop. After the killing, Lau dragged the lifeless body toward the hatch, binding it with the same cord to hoist it upward. His plan was to conceal it long enough to buy time, but something unexpected interrupted him. A sound. From above, faint voices echoed down the shaft, Ah Chun and her father searching for Hao Nian when he failed to appear. Lau froze. He crouched on the roof of the elevator, clutching the cord, his breath shallow, as footsteps approached. Panic set in. Instead of moving the body as planned, he dropped it into the pit below and pressed himself into a corner above the elevator car, trembling but silent. When firefighters arrived minutes later, they found him exactly there, still, watchful and terrifyingly calm. It would have been the perfect crime. There were no witnesses to the attack, no surveillance cameras in the elevator, and no immediate evidence connecting him to the murder. But a single detail would unravel everything. A torn page from a Bible clutched tightly in Hao Nian's hand. And that one fragment would lead detectives straight to the man who thought he was untouchable. Part 5. The God Complex. When detectives examined the torn Bible page clutched in Hao Nian's hand, they traced it back to a missing section in a Bible recovered from Lau Man Cheung's apartment. That single fragment transformed suspicion into a focused investigation. A search warrant was executed. Inside Lau's apartment, police discovered a bag containing a CO2 canister, a length of plastic cord identical to the one found around the victim's neck, and a pair of gloves still marked with residue from the elevator shaft. Every item fit together in a chain of evidence that no longer allowed for coincidence. During interrogation, Lau initially maintained composure. He claimed he had been trapped in the elevator by accident and denied any involvement in the killing. However, when confronted with the torn Bible page, he showed a brief but critical reaction. His hands trembled, and he looked down rather than at the detectives questioning him. That involuntary shift was documented as the first sign of psychological break. After hours of silence, Lau spoke. His words were not of guilt or fear, but of conviction. He stated, "Hao Nian stood in the way of what God intended. I did what was required." This statement demonstrated cognitive distortion, an internalized belief system in which moral reasoning was replaced by a self-justifying narrative. Forensic psychologists later identified two primary drivers in Lau's behavior. The first was obsessive fixation on Ah Chun. His personal journals, seized during the investigation, described her not as a person with autonomy, but as a promise waiting to be fulfilled. This objectification removed the natural boundaries of rejection and replaced them with entitlement. The second driver was his distorted religious belief. Lau treated his interpretation of scripture as authorization. He redefined his violent impulses as spiritual duty, reframing an act of deliberate homicide into what he believed to be obedience. This cognitive restructuring is a known pattern in cases where offenders align their actions with an imagined higher mandate, reducing internal conflict and suppressing guilt. When confronted with these findings in court, Lau showed no remorse. His testimony was delivered with calm precision, as though explaining a task completed without error. He described the sequence of disabling the elevator, releasing CO2, and strangling Hao Nian without hesitation. His lack of emotional reactivity was classified by behavioral analysts as emotional flattening, a psychological state, often linked with entrenched delusional thinking. The court convicted him of murder. Although sentenced to death, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment after the formal abolition of capital punishment in Hong Kong. In prison, Lau was reported to have spent most of his time in prayer, reinforcing the same belief system that had led him there. This case became a study in how obsession and faith, when fused without restraint, can dismantle the moral boundaries that separate loyalty from betrayal and devotion from violence. The final question left by investigators was not legal, but human. Did Lau Man Cheung truly believe he was carrying out divine will? Or was that belief only the last refuge of a man unwilling to face the reality of his own crime? And that question remains unanswered.